There is no way that I can read the collect for today, which is the prayer that we prayed right at the beginning of the service, which alternates from week to week. There's no way I can read that collect without in some ways thinking of the person who taught it to me. And before I became an Episcopalian, before I had ever attended an Episcopal service, I learned this prayer from a teacher I had in high school named Charles Tate. And he would tell us that he would want us to learn, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest his assigned readings. And I never knew initially where that came from. Read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest the assigned readings. But I learned over time, and as he revealed himself a little bit more in his class, that it came from this collect. And this collect has been going on since the birth of Anglicanism. We have been asked to be a community that read, marks, learns, and inwardly digests the Scriptures. And that reference to the eating of the Scriptures, that comes from the Old Testament, from a moment in the book of Ezekiel where the prophet receives the revelation of God as a scroll, and he eats it, and the taste is of honey, which is, of course, a reference to other parts of the Scripture, and that honey nourishes the prophet and gives him strength. In the same way, we are called to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest the Scriptures. But the way that Mr. Tate used it, he wanted us to know about the world around us, and he is in many ways probably one of the leading heroes of my life. He was the person who taught me what it meant to be a priest, because he was also an Episcopal priest. He had grown up in Boston, in a kind of impoverished neighborhood of Boston. He studied languages. He went to the Boston Latin School. He then went to Harvard. And then he joined the Army when World War II started. He worked in military intelligence. He then worked for the State Department. He then was a peace activist. And then he became an Episcopal priest after marrying a famous atheist daughter. His wife was the daughter of Bertrand Russell. This was a remarkable man. He was full of insight, and he was someone who wanted us to understand the world around us. And someone with the background of Harvard, with the background of the State Department, every class for me was like a revelation of the world around us. And he wanted us to see the world basically in two larger categories, I've come to see. He wanted us to understand, to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest not only our own founding stories, our own narratives as a nation, but he wanted us to look at the founding stories, the myths, as you might say, the myths of other nations. And back in the 1980s, the nation that we were asked to study by him in one of his classes was the Soviet Union. And so I spent my time reading, marking, learning, inwardly digesting Russian literature like Solzhenitsyn's First Circle. And I found myself reading, marking, and learning the major events in Russian history, the October Revolution and the defense of Leningrad. I found myself reading, marking, and learning and digesting the central mythic claims of the Soviet Union of that time, which seemed to center on that moment when the cosmonaut went into space, into orbit, and said, "I see no God." And I was asked to bring that narrative, that myth, and to see how it claimed lives. And I was asked to kind of understand where the Russian people were coming from, where the Soviet Union was. And the other thing that he wanted us to do, besides studying these myths, is he wanted us also to learn parables. He wanted us to see these moments in which parables transform everyday circumstances and make them different. By that I mean that myths claim us. They give us an identity. You couldn't get a soldier to leave Michigan and die in Afghanistan without believing in a myth. Myths are big stories outside of ourselves, and they claim us, and they want us to answer yes or no, and they want us to see the world in black and white, and they want us to see the world in terms of a contest between good and evil, and they want us to fight on behalf of the good, whatever that good tends to be. But parables, these are different. Parables are moments in which the everyday life is lifted up, where you don't see so much a world outside of yourself as you are in a parable invited to go on an interior journey of discovery. And rather than aligning you and putting you to work to defend the right and the good and to engage in these heroic battles, parables want to teach you some moral complexity. They want you to see your world differently. And the central parable that Mr. Tate liked to tell was when he was in school at Harvard. And it was the day or two after Pearl Harbor. And all of the Harvard students immediately enlisted in the class Intro to Japanese because they wanted to learn Japanese because we were going to war with Japan. And Mr. Tate told me one story, which is that he never forgot the lecture that professor of Japanese gave that morning after the attack on Pearl Harbor, in which that professor said to the class, all of whom were getting ready to defend this country, he said, you must learn not only the Japanese language, but you need to love the Japanese people. You need to understand their culture. You need to appreciate the beauty that they raise up for us, because empathy is the most important thing to have when you're in the midst of a conflict. For years, I've wanted to write Mr. Tate a thank you note, and it was always more than I could somehow do. I always needed more than half a day because of how much he meant to me as a teacher. And one of the greatest compliments I've ever received was when one of my classmates from my school said to me when I was doing what I was doing here, he said, you know something, Mr. Tate would be proud of you. And for some reason, I kept on putting it off. And I discovered last year that he died in 2017. So if there's one little point I want you to take away from today as we enter into Thanksgiving time is don't put off the opportunity to say thank you. And also, don't put off living a life that is shaped by gratitude. Because even though I can't say thank you to him directly, I hope that my life can be somehow modeled after his. Because I see in the model of his life the model of Christ's life. But I also want you to think with me a bit about myths and parables, because these are two ways of thinking, and we live in a time in which myths are huge. We're in a time in which there is a kind of mythic war that's being waged over whatever is going to be the controlling narrative of our country. And you have these kinds of different ideas that are floating, different ways that can be encapsulated with just a short word or two. We have the idea of ourselves that is found in the phrase, "Don't tread on me." We have the idea of ourselves that is found in the phrase, "Every person has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." We have an image of ourselves, an idea of ourselves, and a mythic reality built around the understanding of ourselves as a city built on a hill. And in our popular culture, there is a war over the meaning of those myths. And those myths are real, and those myths make a difference. And they want to enlist us in their version of the battle between good and evil. But I want to suggest to you that the proper response for us today as a community is actually to be people of parables. Because parables have their own inner journey, but they also seem to cross the distance of difference. And parables are open-ended, but they kind of transform the world around them. And they have a kind of claim on us that is total. And so we find ourselves in the parable of the prodigal son at the end of the story, standing with the father and the older son in the field and rooting the father on as he's trying somehow to get his older son to come in and join the party. So many times we find ourselves in similar situations, imploring people to cross that bit of distance. So I want to suggest to you that the most important thing that we can be is that we can be people of parables. And the most powerful stories that I've heard from this church over the past 4.5 years that I've served it and had the privilege of being here is that I've heard people who have lived a parable-like life. Earlier this week, I was talking to a parishioner who I use as a kind of trusted counselor, and I was shopping this sermon with her because I said, I don't know exactly if this is going to have any contact. This high myth, parables, it seems really abstruse. And she said, no, it makes sense. She said, you know, my mother-in-law, she never approved of me. She thought I was too liberal, and she was conservative. And she communicated that to me every day she was alive and we were together. But she did something that made me think differently about her. When a young woman in the community became pregnant and was thrown out of her house by her family, my mother-in-law took her in to hers and cared for her until she had the child. And that little parable of her life means so much to me. So we are called, I believe, to be parable makers. We are called to be people of parables of grace. Now, all of this is a way for me to get into an incredibly challenging scripture today from the 13th chapter of Mark. In it, Jesus engages in a kind of description of a mythic end to things, the apocalypse, the time when the world will come to an end. And like everybody else, Jesus believes that this will be a time of complete turmoil and transition, a complete overturning of everything. And the world will end for everybody in Jesus' context will come not with a whimper but with a bang. It will be literally an adventum, an advent, a coming of God in reconciliation, but also God in violence. And strangely enough, throughout this chapter 13, Jesus always is telling his disciples to not weaponize the mythic language. As much as there will be an end, they are called to wait and to watch and to pray and to practice their faith. So though there will be many who will say, I am he, do not trust a Jesus that is depicted over and against a mythic struggle, Jesus is saying. And though you hear of wars and rumors of wars and kingdom rising up against another kingdom, don't you be dissuaded from living a life of faithfulness. Keep watch and wait for me, Jesus is saying. And all of this talk today about this mythic end takes place within the context of Jesus going to his own death on a cross. So Jesus is speaking about the end of the world as his own world is ending. But it also takes place in the larger scope of the Gospel of Mark, which is one in which Jesus teaches only in parables, we read. Because the greatest parable that Jesus teaches is the parable of his own death and resurrection, his own love for us that is willing to cross the distance so that we might be brought in. And that's a parable of grace. And just like the woman who gives her last 2 coins, Jesus has come to shed his love in our midst and to hope that we might become bearers of parables too. So we are called to look for a Jesus who is bound up in the struggles of everyday life. And I've put before you a little painting that you can take away with you today and pray about. It's by Georges Rouault. He was had an incredible itinerary as an artist. He started out being trained as a stained glass composer, a maker, and then he went into art. And then as he went into art, he became impatient with the received orthodoxies of church art, and so he began to spend a lot of time painting clowns and prostitutes. And then after a time, he suddenly began to return to Christian themes. And Rouault wanted us to see that what makes a painting Christian isn't the fact that you are painting Jesus. What makes a painting an expression of Christian work is that that painting itself bears witness to suffering and death and redemption and complexity and love and inclusion. So the painting of Jesus that he has with us today, it looks a little bit like you might see it in stained glass because he has these dark, thick lines. And you would almost see in the face of Christ some of the features of an icon because the nose is really long. And if you notice on many icons, the nose is always incredibly long. But ultimately, what Rouault wants us to see in this painting is a Jesus who is immersed in everyday life, looking out, hoping to meet our gaze. How will you make a parable of your life?